everyone. I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I'm Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. Today's lecture is second part of the lecture in the ongoing series on English poems. And this lecture is titled English Poetry, Introduction and 20th Century. So, in the first half of the lecture, we discussed some conceptual ideas about this form of expression. What do we mean by poem? What does the word poetry imply, if it is any different from the word poem? And of course, also, how is it different from other forms of expression such as prose and other disciplines such as science as well. So, with this kind of a comparative, contrasting, I would say, approach, we understood what is the essence of a poem. Okay. Now, in this part of the lecture, we are going to talk about poems in the 20th century, which also is the focus of this lecture series that we have recently begun. Now, the first thing that we have to understand is what exactly is special about the 20th century, right? Because if we know what are the important or the defining features or the defining events in 20th century, we also automatically start to have a sense of the forms of expression that would flourish then. So, the first thing that we say is that there was quite a shift in themes and expression from the 19th century to the 20th. You see, particularly when we talk about poetry or poems or English poems, we know that poems started to be written in the medieval times, right, during the Middle English period, which is around the 7th, 8th centuries, as back in time as then. Since then, poetry has been written, and of course, each age has seen a distinct style emerge in poems, right? Now, when we talk about the 20th century, we see that it is markedly different from how poems were written in the 19th century. So, what was the difference, you might ask? The first thing that we say is that in the 19th century, poems were centered around themes of nature, city, imagination, fancy, etc. Now, immediately the moment I use these terms, I know if somebody who has read a bit of literature would know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Romantic poets. Yes, so in the 19th century, Romantic poetry flourished. It is considered to be one of the very, very important movements in poetry, where poets like Wordsworth, Blake, Shelley, they were writing, and they kind of depicted nature. They also engaged with the changes that were occurring in the city. What changes and why were they occurring? Because of the industrialization. So, England was industrialized around that time, and I would say that the effect or the impact of the industries were seen on the city landscape, and the Romantics were concerned with that. So, therefore, that also becomes a part of the 19th century poetry, and of course, imagination is at the center, because for them, they had to find that kind of inspiration or alternate space in imagination. They wanted to have that distance from the immediate reality in order to keep at the center that which really mattered in a world which was now headed towards industrialization, right? So, this was the thrust of 19th century expression, and particularly 19th century poetry. Now, from there, when we come to 20th century, which is where our focus is supposed to be. Now, in 20th century, the themes of the self, the world, the distortions, the disruptions, the confusion, alienation, all these started to appear as ideas in 20th century poetry. Now, you might wonder why, right? One of the foremost reasons is that poetry in 20th century was an offshoot of the two very important world events. Which were they? The two world wars, right? The First World War and the Second World War. The First World War, which was from 1914 to 1918, and the Second World War, which was from 1935 to 49. Now, these two events, world events, had such a magnanimous impact that it led to widespread destruction of life, property, mindless violence. People were not even aware why were the state of affairs this way, why for that matter was the war even being fought. So you see, it was a very, very grim moment in human history, and this is the time when 20th century poetry also comes into being. So while yes, there are other themes as well, but this is an important defining feature of 20th century poetry, right? Now, I would like to discuss with you just some glimpses of certain important 20th century poets, right? The first poet of 20th century that is widely read, widely talked about is T.S. Eliot. Now, T.S. Eliot was born in 1888 and was around until 1965, right? And he's one of the 20th century's greatest poets, as well as a central figure in the English language modernist poetry, right? He was an Irish, but of course, the poems that he wrote, they had a huge impact, and even till date, his poems are, very, very seminal to modernist poetry. Now, he first attracted attention for his poems with the poem The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which was written around 1914 and 1915. Then it was followed by this poem, which is also hailed as one of the defining moments of English literary modernism, that is The Waste Land, which was written in 1922. In fact, those who talk about periods of history in literature, they start modernist history with the publication of Waste Land, which is in 1922. That's how important T.S. Eliot's works were. Then the other poem was The Hollow Men in 1925, then The Ash Wednesday in 1930, and yet another set of poems, Four Quartets, in 1943. Now you see, if you just also look at the titles of his poems, The Waste Land, The Hollow Men, The Ash Wednesday, what does it tell us? It paints a grim picture. Wasteland, which is nothing, right? Nothing can grow there. It's a wasteland. He imagines world as the wasteland. The hollow men. He's visualizing men as hollow, right? Ash Wednesday. Wednesday, which is ashen, which is maybe full of, what is left behind when everything burns down. So that's what we were saying, that in 20th century poetry, the two world wars played a significant part in defining the sensibility of the poets. Now let us look at this little excerpt from The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, and you will understand what I'm trying to say about 20th century poetry. It says, and that's how the poem actually begins. This is the first stanza of the poem. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask. What is it? Let us go and make our visit. Now, let's look at the sense that is generated in this poem. A, of course, it's not, as I was telling you in my previous lecture, in the previous part of the lecture, this poem doesn't rhyme, right? But definitely there is a mood which is created. How is the mood created? What is the mood? It's very somber. It's very sad. And how is the sad or the somber mood created? Now, of course, we see that there's a poetic I and who's telling somebody along with him to come along to a particular place, right? And through that, he describes the situation or the surroundings. Now, see how does he describe the evening? He says, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Means evening comes across as dull, as sad, as painful, just as there is a vision of a patient that has been given an anesthesia and is about to be operated upon by a surgeon. So that's what he compares the evening with, like a patient etherized upon a table. Etherized, it cannot move. It is lying still, right? There is pain, of course. There is injury, of course. There is disease, of course. So all this is evoked through the image of a patient etherized upon the table. And he says that's what the evening looks like. And in fact, you see, it is a very, very popular phrase, a popular line by T.S. Eliot. He says, therefore, let's go through certain half-deserted streets. Now, the streets are also not bustling. They are not, full of activity and happiness. No, they are half-deserted. Once again, bringing out the post-war atmosphere. The muttering retreats of restless nights. Again, nights are restless. People are no longer, sleeping peacefully. Restless nights. And sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Sawdust restaurants. Now, what is sawdust? You see, when you scrape the dust, when you scrape the wood, there are these wood shavings which come out, right? Sawdust restaurants. So, restaurants which are not of luxury but have sawdust. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. They lead you to an overwhelming question, what is it? So, just the description of the evening in such elaborate detail captures the mood. What is the mood? Streets are half deserted, evening is like a patient etherized on the table. The restaurant is not a luxurious restaurant, a place of ease, but instead it's a sawdust restaurant. The nights are restless. The streets are like a tedious argument. So the entire sense is evoked through just these words. And now again, connect it to what we were discussing in the previous lecture. Language is figurative. A lot of, one can say, a vast meaning is conveyed through fewer words. That's exactly what we were talking about, right? So this is for us, T.S. Eliot, for a bit. Now I'm sure that you would want to pick up his other poems and also read. And in our, of course, in coming lectures, we're going to pick up some texts and discuss them at length. But this is just to give you a sense of what 20th century poetry reads like. And the next very important 20th century poet is W.B. Yeats, born in 1865. He was around till 1939. And his major works include The Land of Heart's Desire, Wild Swans at Cool, The Tower. Now, these are some of the important poetry collections by Yeats. So, we see that he started writing in the towards the end of the 19th century, and he's writing in the early part of the 20th century, right? He was the poet of Irish traditions. Irish history, people, language, traditions, nationalism, All these inform his poems. And particularly what sets Yeats' poetry apart is the use of symbol and imagery. That is what is characteristic of Yeats's poetry. You would notice that, a lot of times Yeats would also create symbols of his own. And he would give meanings to these symbols. For example, an inverted vortex. For example, a gyre. For example, a staircase. All these are symbols that Yeats created on his own and which would then reappear in his poems. And they would have a particular significance. So he also created his own, I would say, a repertoire of symbolism as well. Now let us look at this excerpt from the poem, The Second Coming, which is again a very important poem by W.B. Yeats. Now here in this poem actually he's talking about the coming of a new era. Okay, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now again, very, very widely quoted lines by W.B. Yeats, which capture what? Capture the change of the times. And when the times are changing not for the good, but for the worse, that is what is captured by Yeats in this particular stanza, right? And once again, why is he capturing that? You know it by now. You see, this is that lingering sense in the 20th century poets. I was talking about that how, Yeats uses the symbol. Here also in The Second Coming, he uses a symbol of a gyre. Now what is a gyre? It's actually a geometrical figure, right? Which you can imagine in the form of a cone, right? Which has a broad base at the top and it starts getting narrower towards the bottom. So he says turning and turning in the widening gyre. So that turning, so he visualizes or he uses the symbol of the gyre to maybe imagine the changing state of affairs, and how the changing state of affairs are not going up, but they are going narrower. They are getting narrower. They are not going somewhere positive. So he says the things fall apart and the center cannot hold. Means that there is no center which would anchor people anymore. Everything is falling apart. Things are crumbling. Anarchy is loosed upon the world. There is no structure. There is chaos everywhere. Blood-dimmed tide is loosed. Now imagine the tide of blood. And everywhere, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Innocence is no longer, it has no space in this universe anymore. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Means that the best people who are with good values, good morals, good sense, they lack conviction. Why? Because this world has no space for them. While the worst are full of passionate intensity. While the ones that are bad, the worst, they are the ones that are thriving and they are passionate and they are full of passion at this point of time. But the real ones, the genuine ones, the true ones, they lack all conviction. So just in this one stanza, see how much he's evoked the sense of the times, right? This is the power of the 20th century poet W.B. Yeats. Next, we come to this other very important poet, of 20th century, who also is called as the war poet, by the way, right? So, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, both of them were, very, very popularly called as the war poets of the 20th century. So, I thought after looking at Eliot and Yeats, that are big names in 20th century poetry, we must also look at Sassoon, who is called as as a war poet. Now, he was an English war poet, writer, and a soldier. He became one of the leading poets of the First World War. His poetry both described the horrors of the trenches and satirized the patriotic pretensions during the war. Right? This is primarily what he captured through his poetry. So, let us look at this poem, a very short poem by Sassoon, and it is titled Attack. So, once we read this, you will get a sense of what we mean by or what are the features of a war poet. This is the time when he is, in this poem, he evokes the sense of a soldier or an army that are preparing for an attack, right? Let us look at the poem. At dawn, the ridge emerges, emerges massed and done in the wild purple of the glowering sun, smouldering through sprouts of drifting smoke that shroud the menacing scarred slope, and one by one tanks creep and topple forward to the wire. The barrage roars and lifts, then clumsily bowed with bombs and guns and shovels and battle gear. Men jostle and climb to meet the bristling fire. Lines of grey, muttering faces, masked with fear, they leave their trenches, going over the top, while time ticks blank and busy on their wrists, and hope, with furtive eyes and grappling fists, flounders in mine. Oh Jesus, make it stop. Now, what is he doing here? He's first, creating the scene of a war front where there are tanks, there's barbed wire, there are trenches where the soldiers are hiding, and the tanks are going forward, right? And once the tanks, as he says, creep and topple forward, you see, look at the word, they're not moving, but they are toppling forward. Topple means, when it has a sense of falling off. They topple forward to the wire. The barrage roars and lifts, then clumsily bowed with, now look at this phrase, clumsily bowed with bombs and guns and shovels and battle gear. Means that these soldiers are kind of bowed under the weight of all this artillery for war. Bombs, guns, shovels, and all the things, all these weapons are really putting them down. It's pulling them down because it is heavy. The men jostle and climb to meet the bristling wire of fire. Lines of grey, muttering faces. That's what the faces look like. Grey lines, masked with fear. Their face is full of fear, right? Not happy faces, not healthy faces, but lines of grey. They leave their trenches going over the top, while the time ticks blank and busy on their wrists. So, time is ticking blank, meaning there is no sense of time on the war front. When the soldiers are going out to attack, what time is it? Nobody knows. How long has it been? Nobody knows. The only measure is whether you're alive or you're not. So that's why time ticks blank and busy on their wrists. Busy on their wrists because they're using the weapons of destruction. And hope with furtive eyes and grappling fists flounders in mine, oh Jesus, make it stop. This is in the last sentence, he brings his master stroke. Having discussed the war front, the soldiers, they're carrying weapons, they're fighting, they're preparing for the attack. While they're preparing for the attack, they are going ahead and attacking. But what is the thought in their mind? Oh Jesus, make it stop. A very, very sharp critique of war. And this is what these poets did in 20th century, and that's what made their poetry incredibly sharp